Last year, I found myself deep within the best of what gaming had to offer. Elden Ring, Hogwarts Legacy, Uncharted, and all the games I had in my backlog, I finally dusted them off the shelf. It's fair to say that I had a lot of good games to play. Yet, this year I've felt very stagnant with video games. All the games that have been coming out that I've taken interest in have been remasters for the most part. Starfield came out, and to be fair, it looks good, but I'm still somehow more hyped for the next Mass Effect game that won't be coming out until like 2026. This has happened to me multiple times. Some years are absolutely stacked with video games that you've been waiting for, and some are stacked with good games that you have absolutely no interest in. And during these times I find myself straying outside of my norm, into unknown territory. There's something really fascinating about indie games. I've always wondered how a small group of devs, or even singular developers, are able to create games that are beloved as much as, if not more, than the biggest titles out there. FNAF came from a struggling developer who made children's games, and now it has turned into one of the biggest horror franchises of all time. Minecraft was made by a small group of devs and now is the highest sold game of all time. I could go on with these examples. Games like Blasphemous and Dead Cells are considered some of the best action games out there, yet are incredibly simple in their designs. There is a lot to this genre. This video will not cover even a small fraction of it, because the indie genre is the most independent and creative genre out there. It's a genre dedicated to the average gamers who wanted to create something special, and to the incredibly talented developers who couldn't find a spot in a studio. There's far too many games for me to cover, so I will not even attempt to cover the whole of this genre in this video, but I'll give my best take on what makes indie games so unique and at times better than the AAA games that are coming out these days. Indie games are very creative, mainly because they can afford taking risks that AAA games can't. This is why so many indie games end up going mainstream, because they have the freedom and agency to explore what the hell they want in the way they want to do it. This freedom also leads to developers being able to experiment and even sometimes create entire new subgenres and mechanics within their games. As well as this, indie developers often use their games to pay homage to the older games that have faded with time, bringing a new face to their games. Great examples of this would be the Metroidvania indie games, which heavily take inspiration from Castlevania and Metroid games. Another good example of this is Dusk and Ultrakill. Both are incredibly fast, movement-based shooters that resemble the early Quake and Doom games, bringing their older aesthetics back and taking on the new face of boomer shooters. And outside of the various other subgenres out there, the indie genre has created some incredibly beautiful and artistic experiences. Artistic expression is an incredibly important thing when developing a game, as it dictates a lot of the atmosphere, aesthetic, and narrative. Indie games frequently feature distinctive art styles that showcase the vision of the developers. These games use art as a storytelling medium, and can be visually stunning, even with limited budgets. And one thing that I've always found is that the most beautiful games are usually the ones with the simplest art styles. At least on the surface, but as we go deeper, even the simplest styles are way more detailed, and sometimes rich with the story of the game. And at other times, there are games that are completely the opposite. Take Disco Elysium's art style, for example. It's incredibly unique, making the game feel like you're playing inside of a painting. But it isn't just eye candy. It reflects the game perfectly. Disco Elysium is a game that's, in my opinion, quite out of place. Not only with its storytelling, but also in the way the game plays out. It's incredibly unique, and mixing Disco Elysium with a bland art style would have made it seem like a mismatched experience. So instead, they chose to use a very, very unique style that I have barely seen in any other video games. And as I said earlier, a game's art style can say a lot. And one thing that makes this incredibly abundant is environmental storytelling. Indie games often excel at telling stories through the environment and through the subtle details. Players can discover rich lore and backstory by exploring the world. One example of this that I haven't found elsewhere is a survival game I recently discovered, Signalis. Signalis doesn't terrify the player directly. In fact, the monsters in the game are not really scary. But the way the game frames itself and the way the atmosphere gets increasingly tense makes this game feel terrifying. There's a really great moment in the game where you explore a conference room, and on the walls you see posters which you can interact with, and they specifically tell you not to carry many items with you in case you need to run, or that you should never waste bullets and to kick enemies while they're down. But the way it's framed makes it feel like we were meant to see them. As well as that, you can find tons of notes, papers, notebooks, and guides that will reveal a small bit of lore from the game in very ominous ways. Even things like going to the save menu and selecting continue without saving prompts you with the statement, "You'll regret this later." Environmental storytelling is a thing that so many games fail at. It's an attribute that takes years of experience to do correctly. Yet, even the slightest and simplest touches to a game, using this can up the atmosphere and story of the game drastically. And yet any of the features I listed in this video are all useless without this one: passion and heart. So many indie games have been developed for years and years because the developers care about making a game that is worthwhile, something that any person could sit down and enjoy. This is, or at least should be, the driving factor in game development. I don't like talking about the same things in multiple videos, but some game studios are completely washed out when it comes to making games that people want to play. So many players buy a game from a AAA studio because they've known that they have good games in the past, and as the studio markets their game as the ultimate next adventure, anyone would get on board with that. But here's the issue: it's all bullshit. Since Modern Warfare 2019, the Call of Duty franchise has been copy-pasted with some gameplay tweaks onto each year. Bethesda is still stuck with their original RPG formula, which is outdated, and so many other studios like Ubisoft still make the same game year after year, and market it as something else other than a ripoff. The AAA scene is at its peak with the same games being released year after year, which is why we pay attention to the little guys, the developers who are making games for us. Indie games have been growing like crazy since the start of the 2010s, as a lot of stuff in the gaming industry became accessible. Now, if you want to make a game, you can. All you have to do is learn an engine and start. But it takes so much more than that to create an incredible game, which so many indie devs have been able to do, sometimes completely alone. And yet the studios that we used to look up to can't seem to make a unique game. But with this all said, the indie genre is at its biggest point and it's only growing from here, which means that more indie devs will get recognition for their work, and more aspiring developers can feel encouraged to start their work. And it's only looking up from here.